this at your leisure if you're ever inclined to, but that's how I went about doing it. And no surprise that I began with an image of the vehicle that marked the introduction of Europeans to these shores in 1609. And that really arose out of Henry Hudson's journey here. So we'll show that on the screen. And I'll just make one observation and anybody else can chime in. This journey in 1609 did not mark the settlement of New York or before that New Amsterdam. This was Hudson's journey sponsored by the Dutch to find a way to China for spices. He never got to China, but he got to Poughkeepsie and Albany, and that was about as far as he got. But in 1609, he was on the Havaman. Any thoughts about any of that?
Must have been quite a disappointment.
I don't know.
So he thought that the northern route to the Far East, where Europeans could get spices, would be through the Atlantic Ocean and then up and then north, thinking he might reach China. He got as far as Albany when he ran aground because the water, it was not, I guess he was on the wrong course and it was not high enough, so he turned back and he went back to the Netherlands. But he revealed that the Hudson River, the river that later bore his name, was a fascinating place, that it was rich in natural resources, beaver and the like. So the Dutch began thinking about putting up a colony in what was at first New Netherlands that ultimately became New York in 1664. So I contacted a guy named Chip Reynolds, who, as some of you may know, built a replica of the Havaman 8 or 10 years ago. It was in Newburgh and a little bit on this side of the river.
Yeah, it was docked here. It was docked here in Poughkeepsie. And as a former sailing person, I went on board and I was astounded at how high above the water it is and how narrow the ship was. In sailing terms, that's called windage, and it's something to be avoided. So that's just amazing that they made it.
What was it like on board, Lou?
Extremely cramped, but of course, I've been on the Constitution and replicas of the Mayflower too, so that was totally expected. What surprised me, as I say, was how narrow it was and how high above the water the deck was. Real old-fashioned design. And it easily moved by the wind even when the sails aren't up, kind of thing. So.
Well, Chip Reynolds is more than a skipper. He's also I think he's a PhD in history or some related field, and I got to know him a little bit. And there was a first mate named Jewett, and there exists a writing called Jewett's Diary. And in Jewett's diary, Jewett recorded where the ship was at a particular time. And I asked Chip Reynolds, when did the ship get to what turned out to be Poughkeepsie? Of course, at that time, it wasn't anything. It didn't become Poughkeepsie until decades later. So he takes out Jewett's diary and he says, which way? Oh, on the way up or on the way back? And he revealed to me that the Havaman got to Poughkeepsie on September 15, 1609, northbound, and southbound on the way back September 28. Isn't that amazing? This is recorded in Jewett's diary. So Jewett got, so the Havaman got back to Holland, and we then began as Dutch. We were all Dutch at that time. We spoke Dutch. It was 2 generations before we as New Yorkers became English or recognized the word New York. So, Jana, we can go to the second image. When the English took over with James I, his brother, the Duke of York, took on New York as a proprietary colony. And immediately when the British took over, it was by force. The Dutch surrendered. A shot was not fired, but the Dutch surrendered because they knew they had no chance against the British warships. And the British Crown took over, and within a year instituted the first set of laws, the first legal tract. I'm not going to say in America because Virginia may have had comparable laws, but surely the first legal tract in what was to become New York. You could look at the Dutch laws, rather the Duke's laws, they're all online. And it reads like sort of like a mini version of McKinney's.
Wow.
Just go to Duke's laws. This is, the version here is the original. But if you were to go to McKinney, or rather to Google and look at Duke's laws, you'll find 100 provisions ranging from, through every, it really is like McKinney's in A to Z. Among them, sad to say, was the first codification of slavery, because the Dutch practiced slavery, as did most nations, but it was by custom and usage. And under the Duke's laws, it was codified. And this was the first statute by which slavery was recognized in New Amsterdam. Anybody? So go to the Duke's law sometimes and you'll see how extraordinary it is. It really is not, it's like 380 years old, but it isn't that different from the way we write laws today. The language is arcane and the usages and the phraseology is different, but it's basically a legal tract about how people get on. It dealt with a court system, courts of assizes. It dealt with jurisdictional powers, and it dealt with rules of governance of how people get on with one another. So I commend that to you. Jana? Next. Yeah, that is what we started to look like. What you see there is New York State, but at the time, in 1683, shortly after the British took over, everything to the west was part of Albany. The individual counties did not develop county by county until decades later, but New York is shown in this 1683 image, having as its components a dozen or so counties, which included Dutchess. So we were among the first counties. And I think one of the next slide should show the counties that that comprised, can you go back a little bit, Janet? I don't know that it lists the counties. Oh yes, if you blow it up, you'll see that it does list New York County, Dutchess, Ulster, Queens County, which later consumed Long Island, Suffolk County, Westchester, and a couple of them that are no longer with us. And the growth of counties westward began after 1683.
Judge, this is when Dutchess encompassed what is now Putnam and Columbia as well, didn't it?
Exactly.
It looks very big.
Yeah, Putnam for sure. And we were administered out of Ulster because there was more population and growth on the west side of the river. And eventually George Clinton, our first governor, was from Ulster County, although he had a home here. So Jana, let's move on. No one knows for sure what the first courthouse looked like. We're not even sure where it was. Most historians are ready to say that it is on the site But the first courthouse, because there was no photography until maybe 1850, so we're not sure what the first two courthouses look like. But the first courthouse we know was established under the laws of 1715, chapter 683. I'm not sure, but it was under the laws of 1715, and that was our first. And it's an artist's sketch. For anybody who's interested, it's the laws of 1713, chapter 271, built in 1715. And to build a courthouse and a prison. So that was the first. And again, it's a sketch of, shall we say, mild provenance, but not more. So we'll go to the next one.
Do you think it's in the same location as the existing courthouse?
Yes, there's reason to think that, but I'm not an expert on the deeds. Some enterprising deed lawyer might be able to figure that out. I'm sure people do know. The second courthouse burned down, and this is an artist's rendition. It was probably a brick structure, and it might well have been a handsome structure, as is shown here. So this second courthouse was burned down, as so many of the buildings did in those days, because they had no particular fire prevention. It was bucket brigade. And we were in that courthouse for a couple of decades when Poughkeepsie had become the state capital. We were the state capital because during the Revolutionary War, we had become founded as a capital in Kingston. We were born as a state in Kingston, but when the British chased us around, we settled as our temporary capital in Poughkeepsie. And when the Constitution was drafted, we were settled in Poughkeepsie. Anybody else on that? Feel free.
I know in Fishkill there are signs in front of two of the churches that they were locations that were utilized for the drafting of the Constitution.
Yes, indeed. You're going to see in the next slide, or the one after, a copy of the first New York State Constitution of 1777, which was printed by Samuel Loudon of Fishkill. And he was the printer of New York's first Constitution, which was crafted partly in White Plains and partly in Fishkill. And we were drafting this Constitution as we were at war. And the three drafters had their quill in their hand, and they're writing this Constitution up on the run. And it's an astonishing document. Realizing how.
County Courthouse.
Please go ahead. I didn't. Please go ahead. Who's ever? Adina?
Yeah, sorry. I was just showing my husband the picture of the courthouse. Yeah.
So Jana, go ahead. Let's see where we can go from there. Yeah, that is the courthouse in 1787, in which the United States Constitution was ratified. We became a state in 1777, and we and the other colonies that had broken away from the British formed the Articles of Confederation, and we lived as sort of like a European Union, as a confederacy for that decade from 1777 to 1787. Then in Philadelphia, we got together and we formed a union in 1787, wrote the Constitution, and then it fell to each of the states as to whether they want to buy into the union and join the union. And this happened in Poughkeepsie at the courthouse now on the screen. Let's look at that for a minute. Any thoughts on that, anybody?
Robert's here. He says the vote was 30 to 27.
Yeah. The 30 were called, the 27 were anti-federalists, and they were against the Constitution for very good reason. Does anybody know why? why they were called anti-federalists and why they were in no hurry to buy into a federal government?
I think it had to do with debt, right?
No, I think it had to do with the lack of a Bill of Rights and the
State rights.
states' rights as well. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. New York was a powerful state, and we would have lost a lot of income through our imports with the Commerce Clause. But as Luke points out, the original document as drafted in Philadelphia had no amendments. Of course, it was drafted. The amendments came in 1791 after some protests that there was nothing to check the federal government from abusing its powers against the citizens. And these protests arose in Poughkeepsie in 1788 when Melancton Smith and others said that they did not want to go into the federal union unless there was a Bill of Rights. And so we wrote to James Madison saying that we're in no hurry to join the union until there's a Bill of Rights that checks the federal government from its powers. And during that 3-year period, Madison promised that he would promulgate a Bill of Rights, and he did so in 1791, and that accounts for the Bill of Rights and the 27 or so rights that are included among them. First Amendment, freedom of religion, free exercise, anti-establishment, free speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, Second Amendment, guns, Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, Fifth Amendment, due process, double jeopardy, taking of private property, Sixth Amendment, right to trial, right to counsel, juries, Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, and so forth. So these rights arose because of the protests in Poughkeepsie based on our refusal to buy into the federal government until we got a Bill of Rights. Anybody? Anybody there?
Yeah, we're here.
We're here.
Yeah. Go Poughkeepsie.
Yeah. Who would have thought we were? Yeah. Who would have thought it was that we would have been so progressive? I guess that's the way to put it.
Well, we were
Yeah.
afraid.
Thank
Yeah, I guess.
goodness.
Yeah, Catherine, that's a good word. You can call it progressive. We were concerned, having been under the thumb, of George III, and we just got out from a monarchy, and we wanted to make sure that the new federal government was not going to be another George III. And Alexander Hamilton said, well, that makes no sense. How can we as a free people be under the thumb of a monarch when we're now free? But Melancton Smith and the others in Poughkeepsie said, beware the federal government. They can become tyrannical. Aha! And the federal government become tyrannical. Really? Oh my. And there was Melancton Smith saying, we have to check the federal government. And I commend to you Federalist 51. I read Federalist 51 years ago, but I read it recently, and I tell you folks, it is breathtaking. In light of what's going on today, if you read Federalist 51, you say, how could James Madison have been this smart?
Yeah.
He envisioned, almost out of whole cloth, a Congress that was put in place as in the first article, not the second article, which is the executive, not the third article, which is judiciary, but the first article is the Congress. It is there to check executive excessive power. It is a check on executive power, and he explained it, and he wrote it that way, and he explained how the three branches of government, and he lays this out so beautifully in Federalist 51 that you say, it's like James Madison has never left us, and he's looking over our shoulder right now. So I really, I commend that to you.
Judge, if I may,
I'm sorry?
Judge, the State Bar Association about 35 years ago sponsored a film called An Empire of Reason, about the ratification of the Constitution in New York State.
Hmm.
And it has a whole bunch of celebrities in various roles. They did a unique twist on it. They covered it as if it was the ratification of the Constitution was covered in modern dress by
Today.
then popular newscasters. Walter Cronkite's part of it, John Chancellor,
Hmm.
and John Jay was played by then Chief Judge Saul Walker. It's available on YouTube. It's called An Empire of Reason. It's very well done.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Jonah. Thanks for pointing out that it's available on YouTube. I have a copy of it on a disc, but it's there for all to see. And it is so exciting and so dramatically done. The ratification scene in which we, based on Madison's promise for a Bill of Rights, which he gave us in 1788 and which he fulfilled in 1791, took place in the courthouse in Poughkeepsie, and that was dramatized in a drawing at the Poughkeepsie post office, so that when you're in the post office on Market Street, go upstairs to the second floor and you'll see this magnificent mural.
No.
So let's take a good look at it. It's there. It was a WPA mural, and it's just beautifully done. Can we get a little closer up on that, Jana?
No, I don't think we can get any closer, unfortunately. I can email it to people, though.
I think
Okay.
Everybody can individually do it. If you go up to the top of your screen,
Oh, there you go.
view options, you
Oh.
can choose how big you want it to be.
Jana, I think the next slide, the next image gives us, there we go. Okay.
Yeah.
That is the artist's rendition of the three people who counted the most at the ratification in Poughkeepsie in the summer of 1788. George Clinton was the big boss. He was governor of New York and he had all the power. He was he was stuck on New York's impost power and New York's reluctance to surrender its power and to dilute it into a federal union, but was ultimately convinced to do so. With his right hand on Clinton's shoulders, Melancton Smith, who was the primary anti-federalist who rallied for a Bill of Rights and who really swung the convention toward Alexander Hamilton, who was shown at the right. And it was Melancton Smith's statesmanship who convinced the delegation by, as Captain Lazar pointed out, by a vote of 30-27, that we should buy into the Union based on Madison's promise. So here the artist is saying, in effect, all right, Governor, let's shake hands with Hamilton. You know, we have a promise from Madison. We're ready to join. We're joining. We in New York changed the language in joining. First, we said we are joining on the promise, and then we said first in good faith, and secondly in recognition that Madison will be good to his word, and he was. So that's in the Poughkeepsie post office. Now, there's Melancton Smith. No one knows for sure what Melancton Smith looks like. This pencil sketch was drawn by someone, we don't know who. It was drawn by someone, we don't know how good an artist it was. It was found in his daughter-in-law's trunk in Plattsburgh after the Smith family and the Platt family of Poughkeepsie all moved up to Plattsburgh and founded Plattsburgh. So there was a sign marking on this saying Melancton Smith, and that's about the only image that anyone has ever discovered of Melancton Smith. We're not even sure it's him, but it's a fairly good guess that it's him, but no one knows any better. Now let's see. This is this is of more recent interest, and I looked into this because I'm doing a book on slavery and the judiciary, slave cases in the judiciary in the 19th century, and I wondered whether New York had anything to say about the half a dozen or so slavery provisions in the United States Constitution. Hello? I think
We
we're
hear
getting
you,
some
Judge.
Yeah, we can hear.
I'm getting feedback. Okay. I wondered whether New York had made any protest or said anything about the half dozen or so slavery provisions in the United States Constitution, which, by the way, are still there. If you were to take out your little vest pocket copy of the Constitution, you will see the Fugitive Slave Act is still, Fugitive Slave Clause is still in the United States Constitution. It was never repealed. The 3/5 clause was never repealed. That was put into the United States Constitution by Southern slave power because when we formed the two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and the House was based on population, what do you do with 1 million slaves in Virginia? Do you count them as people for purposes of population to expand Virginia's power in the House of Representatives? Or do you count them as property? So Virginia says, well, they're property, they're chattel, but for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives, they're people. So we compromised and we said 3/5. So they were counted as 3/5 of a person. And I wondered, where did New York fit in? Did we have anything to say about these provisions? Or did we, like everyone else, say, hey, this is all part of the price of union and we're going along with them? And sure enough, in the minutes, there's Melancton Smith saying, I just don't like the idea of counting African Americans as 3/5 of a person. And he said that. He was just about the only one in all of the states who actually said that. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. Wow.
Any thoughts on that generally, folks?
I'm curious whether they say free people, did they count women?
Negative. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, yes, yes. Oh, in the population.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
The
But when it came
population,
to
yeah.
voting, yeah. Oh, yes. A very good point. I I could be mistaken, but I've always
No, I think the
assumed
population it is.
in population they counted women.
Mhm.
Yeah. Does anybody know different? No, I'm pretty sure they did. Any other thoughts generally about any input from anybody about ratification, about the slavery provision, the Fugitive Slave Clause, the 3/5 clause, or any of that that's worth sharing?
Well, so this guy who is the one who said something about not liking it, there was, as far as we know, sort of zero real active opposition to letting the slaves be exported. Because I know there are places here that were on the, what do you call it, trail? You know, the
Underground Railroad.
Underground Railroad, right?
Yeah, that's a marvelous point. The reason there was not a lot of protest to the Fugitive Slave Clause was because every single state at the time of ratification allowed slavery, including New York. So when we went to the convention in 1788, we were a slave state, much as Virginia was. Every state that signed on to the Union was a slave state. We did not abolish slavery until 11 years later, when John Jay was governor. We began the process of abolition in 1799, but we didn't complete abolition until 1827. So the reason there was not a lot of protest was, how was New York going to protest if we had laws on the books allowing slavery and the judges were writing up decisions based on contracts and inheritance and all these other slavery issues in which slavery was dealt with in the courts as a commodity?
But I would think if it was only 9 years later when it was abolished, there must have been a social movement. Robert says there was a manumission society in New York that was anti-slavery.
Well, this is the notice, the Anti-Slavery Society.
Yeah, exactly.
slide.
You're quite right. The moral protest was with us for some time, and the language of the Declaration of Independence, of course, was with us, and the Enlightenment was with us, and William Wilberforce in England was with us, and Samuel Johnson, and the others in England, and Lord Cook. So that was slowly seeping into the American profile. And the Manumission Society began in 1785. So we started talk about releasing, even though slavery was legal, the slave owners, the enlightened ones like John Jay said, well, slavery is illegal, but let's start educating them and we'll slowly start abolition. So that's a marvelous point, that the Manumission Society began in 1785. And not surprisingly, it was peopled by folks like John Jay and Alexander Hamilton and Melancton Smith and others of that fiber. Anybody else? We cannot minimize the importance of England in this. The Southerners would blame England for giving us slavery, and in a way that's true, because when Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia had slavery, we were English, and it was really the influence that was overseen by the crown. And when we became free, we continued in slavery, and you might say that England gave us slavery. But if that's true, and if we're going to say that, we also have to appreciate that it was England who set the example in abolition, and with people of the moral force of William Wilberforce, who almost single-handedly brought about abolition of slavery in England, and of course, Lord Mansfield, and in a case called Somerset, which, if anyone is interested in pursuing the history of slavery, was the paradigm case in England in 1772. Anybody?
Al, you know, one of the things that's very seldom mentioned at this period is New York State was still, I think, very much for a long time under the influence of the Dutch, who settled it really and still dominated the thought in the body politic 100 years after they took Manhattan Island in the 1600s. I mean, there was still in Lower Manhattan, in the Lower Hudson Valley, and right up to Fort Albany and even above. These people were all descendants of Dutch settlers, and I don't think there was any love lost ever between the Dutch and the English. And I think, you know, I'm not a scholar in this like you are, but most of the reading that I've ever done doesn't talk much during this period of the formation, the political formation of our early government. These people was the powers that be. The Schuyler family was probably the most dominant family in New York State during those days. You know, and of course Alexander Hamilton was married into the Schuyler family, and you know, I wonder what your thinking is about, you know, particularly in our state, where that fits in. It's not. I can't imagine that it's all England versus the colonists. I mean, these colonists, particularly in our part of the country, are not Englanders. They're mostly really the descendants of the Dutch, are they not?
Yeah, what a good point that is. Even in this county, you know, the Dutch Reformed Church and, you know, the Dutch names in this county, if you look at the people at New York's ratification convention in 1788, by then the British had been here for 100 years, right? I'm sorry. Yeah, the British started in 1664, took over from the Dutch in 1664, and in 1788 we're ratifying. And if you look at the names in Poughkeepsie, by then we were a perfect blend of Dutch and British. And if you look over all the names, you see names like Schoonmaker and Van Schacht and Schuyler and Van Rensselaer and Roosevelt's, and then you see Smith and Clinton and people like Hamilton were both. John Jay was both, and you see many people who were both. I think we're getting some feedback.
John Gifford's got to mute himself.
So I think by that time we're getting a blend of Dutch and English, which I agree they in many ways had no love for each other, but both being Protestant, there was intermarriage, and that created a blend that we see today. Jay was half. And as you point out about Hamilton married into the Schuyler family, and of course the Van Rensselaer family, my goodness, they were the big barons around Albany. So we are basically at the ground level, we're a mixture of Dutch and English, and the other immigrant groups came later to give us the tapestry that we have today.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Any other thoughts? So we're moving on, Janet, with the next. Yeah, I'm looking at this. This is extraordinary. The anti-slavery societies began in Dutchess County. Catherine pointed out that the Manumission Society began in 1785, but after we abolished slavery in 1827, the American movement toward outright abolition that led to the Civil War was very prominent in the 1830s and the 1840s. And at that point, Dutchess County was a mix of people who were supporters of the Underground Railroad, helping the slaves escape from the South up toward Canada. And we began to form anti-slavery groups. And the Dutchess County Historical Society found a poster of someone named Stephen Flagler in Pleasant Valley, at whose home there was a meeting of the Anti-Slavery Society in 1839. Is that cool? There's the poster. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
His name was Stephen Flagler. So I tried to find out who he was, and with a little bit of research, it says Pleasant Valley, but I think it was really Washington Hollow, which is somewhat the same thing. I tried to track his forebears, but his descendants, but the line sort of ran cold. If anybody knows who Stephen Flagler's people are, it would be really fun to meet them and tell them, hey, do you know that your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents hosted a meeting of the Dutchess County Anti-Slavery Society in 1839 in Pleasant Valley? Wouldn't that be something? So there it is. I just happened to find that online, and it's pretty interesting. What's next? Yeah, that, Catherine, earlier you meant, I don't know what, it's a little bit out of order, but that's the first Constitution of 1777. And on the bottom, it would say printed by Loudon in Fishkill. So we can move on. And there's the Bill of Rights that, as we know, was added on to the Constitution of 1787, and it appears full-blown with the first 10 amendments later. Then the 11th Amendment, sovereign immunity, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, the progressive amendments after the Civil War. So in the 13th Amendment, slavery is abolished. In the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights is now absorbed slowly from the federal government, against whom it was obligatory, and is now obligatory against the states under the 14th Amendment, as you all know, and then the other amendments later on, prohibition, women's vote, and the like. So now we get to the Poughkeepsie courthouses. The one after the ratification courthouse is shown right there. Does anybody want to tell us a little bit about that? Can anybody add anything? That was the courthouse that was with us until 1900 or 1901.
This is where the oyster bar was.
Matthew Vassar's Oyster Bar.
Yeah.
He had his hand in everything, that guy.
He did, but every time we talk about oysters in Poughkeepsie before refrigeration, I get a little nauseous. You can't help it every time.
Can you imagine young Matthew Vassar trying to earn, $3 a week selling oysters in the bottom of the courthouse, saying, if I make enough money, I can found a college. So that's what happened. He then, after some modest success, I suppose, at the bottom of the courthouse, opened up a small brewery, became very rich, and became Matthew Vassar. This courthouse immediately preceded the one that we have now, which is shown in a very quaint, beautiful photograph.
Right.
It's, as you know, it's the second one. The first building, which unhappily was torn down, it's a gorgeous Victorian building. It was I think it was the post office. But the courthouse, you can see, was in its early stages with a horse and buggy in front of it. Anybody want to talk about that a little bit?
Too bad they tore all that stuff down.
Yeah. We have lots of pictures of this time in our archives here.
Mm-hmm. And what do you suppose that building is past over where the Civic Center is?
Yeah. Mm.
The building beyond?
Beyond
Right here.
north of the courthouse.
Oh, yeah.
It's a lot.
Wow. No,
I don't know, Catherine, I'm going to have to pull out some of the other angles of it that we have. Maybe we could tell.
Yeah.
Now, when you look at the building of the courthouse, it now bears another story on top. One more story.
Oh,
We built onto it.
Mm.
oh, that's interesting.
Sort of the gabled.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
That was actually that's not just decorative. That's an actual. There were offices up there, in other words.
Mm.
Yeah. What a magnificent building the post office was. Such a shame
Yeah.
that these buildings just got mowed down,
Yeah.
And they were going to tear down. I'm old enough to remember when in the 1980s, they were going to tear down the courthouse and put up some kind of plasticky structure.
Really?
Yeah.
I've never heard that before.
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure.
That would have been a shame.
Imagine what would have gone up in its place.
When we moved here, the Bardavon, Save the Bardavon was going
Yes.
on
Right.
mid to late 70s, I guess.
Mhm.
We would have had a horror show like they had in Orange County.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So out of place in that neighborhood, and completely non-functional.
Yeah.
I mean,
Fortunately,
architecture, it went in the tank all over the country after the Second War. Everything was glass and steel. I mean,
yeah.
public architecture was, I remember when taking my son down to the College of William and Mary, and I have a friend who retired a couple of years ago after 25 years as a professor in the law school there. The front part of the college, the old part of the college, is a part of the Colonial Williamsburg, the whatever you want to call it, the theme thing. The back of the college, it looks like any SUNY college, and not to take, I'm not trying to put any schools down or anything, but
It's a bit of a letdown when you're on the tour.
it is. It's a big.
You're like,
wow.
oh.
We looked at it. At first, it was like, oh wow, William and Mary, beautiful. And it's historic school. And then you go on the back, and it's like, duh, nothing.
It's the architectural style known as early shoebox.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the Levittownization of America. It's a shame, really. I mean, well,
I think we can thank Lucille Patterson for that. There was serious talk, I'm sure loads of newspaper articles about tearing down this courthouse. But we begged Lucille Patterson, and she was listening and open-minded. They were saying, well, it's too big, it's too much repair, it's got to be refurbished, let's put up a new one, it's too hard to heat. And eventually she was satisfied that we're better off fixing up the old one and keeping it instead of some plasticky, what was the word you used, some shoebox? Yeah,
Early shoebox.
that's what would have happened.
Can I tell a 15-second story about you and Lucille Patterson that I remember like it was yesterday? You were both celebrity disc jockeys. You were both celebrity disc jockeys on a country and western station. I think it was EOK, was country and western at the time. And she did her half hour, and you came on, and you said, well, all I can say is you picked a fine time to leave me, Lucille, and you started playing that record. I thought that was the most brilliant thing I've ever heard in my entire life.
Oh.
That was a good 15.
I have no memory of that. That's very funny.
Oh yeah, I was listening. I almost got off the road laughing. It's fabulous.
Very funny.
Judge, was the jail part of the courthouse underground?
Yes, it was, and it's still there. There's a dungeon. I was hoping Arthur Geller might come up, because if you go down in the basement, way down, there's sort of a room that's like a dungeon, and Arthur Gellert's uncle Eli had the key still exists. The key's about that big, and it still exists.
He shows it in the documentary.
Oh my!
And talks about it a little bit.
Oh yeah.
Right.
So let's move on. I know. By the way, if any of you folks have to go, please just peel off. I'll stick around if you like. I don't know if we can set a hard time limit, or people can just peel off and leave if they got things to do. So whatever. Janet, what do you think?
Yeah, that's fine.
I have a date on the first tee with Joe Spiegel and Jerry Hayes at 1:15, so I'll have to cut it.
Okay. Well, started going through the history of our county and came to learn that in the early stages, at least, if not surely later, there were some pretty prominent people that came from our soil, including James Kent, the father of American law, America's Blackstone. We recently found him in a shabby, shattered grave somewhere, and we reorganized his grave back in Beacon, and we raised some money, and James Kent is now, he's buried back on our soil. We raised some money for a proper gravestone, and we had a little bit of a ceremony. So James Kent is back with us, and also Smith Thompson, a justice of the United States Supreme Court, sprang from Dutchess County, and we have those two here.
Smith Thompson is buried at Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery.
Right. Go ahead, John. Any others? Yeah, that looks like Egbert Benson, I believe, New York's first Attorney General. He's from Red Hook, and Governor Morgan Lewis, I think that is, one of our early governors, and they too were from Dutchess County. Morgan Lewis, does anybody know anything about him? I think he came from Rhinebeck.
Statsburg.
Statsburg, yeah, right. Anybody know anything about him?
No.
They talk a little bit about him on the tour at the Mills Mansion, but I don't remember all the facts of it.
Is there a library up that way named after him? Is that possible?
Maybe.
Morgan, yeah, the Morgan Library, I think so.
What about
that's
Benson?
JP Morgan, yeah. But Benson is well known, and Egbert Benson, I think they still have the Egbert Benson Historical Society in Red Hook, but he was quite a guy. Let's see who else we have.
Was Judge Benson a descendant of that Benson?
Judge Rebels.
I would.
What a great question. You know what? You want to hear the answer
I wouldn't
to that?
be surprised. Yeah.
You're asking if he was related to Jim Benson.
Right.
Okay. I asked that, Catherine, to Jim Benson over lunch one time, and he gave a hilarious answer. He said, "You would be doing neither of us a favor, either Benson's, by saying that I'm a relation, because he was a bachelor."
How funny.
Isn't that great?
That's great.
That's funny. That's such his sense of humor too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was great.
Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals, Charles Ruggles from Poughkeepsie. Quite a guy. I came to know a little bit about him when I was on the court, but he really made quite a name for himself in the early years. We're not 100% sure of what he looked like. Does anybody know anything about Charles Ruggles, or anybody want to tell us anything about Charles Ruggles? I'm happy to, but if he has anything, I'm happy to yield.
We have a book here in the office about him, but I've never read it.
Okay.
That's all I know.
This is when, in Judith Kay, in 1994 or so, was doing the 150th anniversary of the New York Court of Appeals. And she, being a great historian, said she wanted to collect images of all the judges of the New York Court of Appeals, and she had every single one but Charles Ruggles. And they're all, I guess most of you have been up to the New York Court of Appeals, and you'll know that the images, the oil paintings, are all on the wall in the courtroom. And they were all there, but Charles Ruggles. No one knew what Charles Ruggles looked like. So Judith Kay called me. I was not on the court at that time, but we were sort of friends. And she knew that I was in the Baker Street Irregulars, the Sherlock Holmes Society. And she said, Al, do you think you could help us find Charles Ruggles, what he looks like? He was from the Hudson Valley. So I said, oh my goodness, Chief, of course. That's easy. Sure, no problem. I thought it was going to be done in 5 minutes, but it was before photography. And the Kingston newspapers and the Poughkeepsie newspapers where he lived had no image of him. And we just didn't know where to find him as to what he looked like. So I wrote to about 7 or 8 historical societies saying, do you have any image of Charles Ruggles? And I did this with Jack Gartland. And about a month later, we get a telephone call from the Senate House in Kingston saying, we have a daguerreotype of Charles Ruggles. It's about as big as your thumb. So come up and see it. So I called Jack Gartland. The two of us go charging up there. And, when you're with Jack Gartland, Jack can go any speed he wants. They're going to leave him alone. So we all went charging up to Kingston at the Senate House. And there's this little daguerreotype. If anybody can explain what a daguerreotype is, please do.
Well, in the days before photographic negatives, they coated a piece of metal with some chemicals, and I'm not into chemistry, but they coated it, they exposed it, and it developed on the piece of metal, and you couldn't reproduce it because there was no negative. It's the kind of thing that was popular before the Civil War. The Civil War, Matthew Brady came in with negative film that could be reprinted, but it was a one-off deal.
Thank you. So there we were. So we go up to Kingston, and they show us this thing. It's about the size of your thumb. And we look at it, and we say, well, how do you know it's Ruggles? They said, well, because it's in a box, and right under it, it says Charles Ruggles. Well, that's, as a judge, would I let that into evidence? Probably, not bad. Not bad. Somebody could cross-examine the hell out of it, but, not bad. So Jack Gartland, in his extraordinary generosity, then hires a painter to make an oil portrait. And what you're now looking at is the oil portrait that Jack Gartland commissioned from this little 1-inch daguerreotype. So the artist is asking us what color eyes. He cannot tell what color eyes Ruggles had. So we did a little bit of research and this and that, and we said to the artist, what do you think? And the artist says, well, I really can't tell, but I'm going to guess he had blue eyes. So the artist gave him blue eyes. And that's about all. That's all we know. Next thing you know, Chief Judge Kay invites Jack Gartland and I to come up to the Court of Appeals, and Jack Gartland presented the oil painting to the court, and it's now hanging in the courtroom, as you see it. Great story.
Mm-hmm.
Jack Gartland. Now, if there are any lawyers who are good with deeds, finding. Hello.
Oh, no, I'm gonna have to go off.
Okay.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
I'm enjoying it. Bye-bye.
If there are any among this group who are good on the county clerk's office in the second floor with deeds, Charles Ruggles lived in Poughkeepsie, and he moved to a place on Delafield Street. If anybody can find his house, we'll put up a monument, but some good deed person has to find that. If you have any friends or people that can do that, I think it'd be fun. But I don't know where on Delafield Street he lived. All I know is somewhere he bought a new house on Delafield Street. He formerly lived right near where the Bardavon Theater is. It was Market Street. It was probably an old country road at that time. So that's the Ruggles story. The next image shows two folks who had the distinction of both being from Dutchess County in the contest for the United States presidency. And I would go around saying that for the United States presidency, two candidates came from the same county, Dutchess County. That will never again happen in the history of the United States, however much longer we go on. I would say that. 45 minutes later, Bill Clinton and Donald Trump put themselves down as from Westchester County.
Yeah.
But they weren't in the same contest, though. They're just both from the same place.
They weren't in the same contest.
And they're
Donald Trump.
not
Donald,
Right, they weren't
I'm sorry.
opponents.
I'm sorry. That's right. Yeah. Okay.
No, they
Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton.
Oh,
Hillary
that's
Clinton.
true. Right,
Donald
right.
Trump.
Right.
Hillary Clinton both put themselves down as from Westchester County. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't that unbelievable?
Donald Trump and Washington.
We no longer have that distinction.
But I don't really think they're either of them from Westchester County.
Not from, well, Hillary and Bill live in Chappaqua still to this day. I don't know that, well, Donald Trump, I know he went to school. That's not even in Westchester either. I don't know what his connection is to Westchester other than his golf club.
In New York.
That's what he put down. But we know Dewey really lived in Pauling, and FDR, of course, in Hyde Park. Those were bona fide.
Right.
They were bona fide Dutchess County people.
Oh yeah, definitely.
There were people that some of us may have known that were old enough to know that worked on Dewey's estate on the lawn, or we know people that were in Dewey's on Dewey's property. That was 1940s. The people were still around a few years ago.
And Bernie Kessler had some great FDR stories. Mm-hmm. His parents were friendly with Franklin and Eleanor.
Yeah. So what do we have next, Jenna?
I think that was it.
Well, what do you think? That's a pretty good from 1609 to up through the present. Anybody want to add anything or?
Thank you, Judge. That was
yes. Thank you so much,
Judge. You were talking a little bit earlier about Morgan Lewis.
Yeah.
And it turns out, because the name Lewis is familiar to me, growing up not too far from Francis Lewis Boulevard in Queens. Mm-hmm. Francis Lewis signed the Declaration of Independence, and Morgan Lewis was his second son. So he's direct descendant of a signer of the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, Francis Lewis was a signer?
Of the Declaration of Independence, yes.
From Queens?
I don't know where he's from, but he has a whole street named after him in Queens.
Yeah. Yes, I know. It's a traffic jam.
Yeah, Francis Lewis, was a person. He's one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and his second son is Morgan Lewis. So he's a direct descendant of a signer.
That is cool. Well, Morgan Lewis is really decked out like a big time, with all kinds of epaulets and everything.
Yeah.
Well, he had a terrific career. I mean, he was, judge, military. He had a great career, and he lived a long time too.
John,
Thank you, Judge. On behalf of the bar, I want to thank you for spending the time with us this afternoon, I mean, and we really appreciate it. And your knowledge is tremendous, and we want to do it again sometime in the not too distant future.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.